Hello and welcome. Welcome to the first Institute event of 2022. When I say Institute, I mean the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery, of course, at NSCAD University. I'd like to begin first by giving a territorial acknowledgement, and then I'll proceed to introduce myself and our wonderful guest for this afternoon's talk. So NSCAD is in Mi'kma'ki on the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. It's very important to note that these lands were never ceded. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqet or Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties never dealt with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqet or Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So I'm very grateful to be here with you in the territories known as historically and still today as Mi'kmaq or Mi'kma'ki, and specifically to be coming to you from virtually from NSCAD University. So first, who am I? My name is Charmaine Nelson. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you here today. I'm a professor of art history and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement. And I'm also the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery, a first in Canada and in the world. I'm very proud and pleased to be able to introduce to you one of our first cohort of virtual fellows. Jason Cyrus is a graduate student fellow, and he was a fellow in the first cohort of 3 that began and finished their fellowships in the fall of 2021. Jason analyzes fashion and textile history to explore questions of identity, cultural exchange, and agency. He was the 2021 Isabel Bader Fellow in Textile Conservation and Research at the Agnes Etherington Centre at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. In October, he presented his research in History is Rarely Black or White, an exhibition exploring Victorian cotton, transatlantic slavery, and its ongoing legacies. And I'm sure he's going to share with us some of that research this evening. Jason Cyrus has a master's degree in art history and cultural studies from York University and started his PhD in the history of art at Warwick University in October 2021. He has held research posts at the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Royal Ontario Museum. In January 2020, he curated York University's first fashion exhibition, Reframing Gender. His winning Institute Fellowship project was entitled Dressing for the Resistance, Style as Armour amongst Black Canadians. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Jason, who's going to share with us his slides and talk us through his career, his study, what he's working on now, what he worked on at the fellowship. And then I'll be back at the end for a Q&A. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat or the Q&A for Jason. Thank you. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Charmaine, for that wonderful introduction and also for the platform. Not just as of today to be able to share of the work that we have done together, but also for your mentorship and for your encouragement in creating this cohort and creating the Institute. It's an extreme pleasure to be with you all. Hello from cold and rainy London. I'm here, as Charmaine mentioned, doing my PhD, and I'm quite homesick. So it's good to be able to have these events to remind myself of where I'm from. Now, today, what I thought I would do is, first of all, give you a little taste of who I am. I'll do a little overview at the beginning about some of the work I've done thus far, some key themes in the work that I do, and what allows me to, in a sense, bring ideas together. And as I've established that, I will then go into the project that has been the core of my fellowship at the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery here at NSCAD. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll get a broader sense of who I am, how I'm able to, or at least the ways that I think, how I bring archives together, the questions I ask, and what drives me to go forward and to be able to do the work that I do. So I'm going to screen share. We'll get going. Alrighty. Charmaine mentioned the project that I worked on, or that I'm in the process of birthing with the Institute, is called Dressing for the Resistance, Style as Armour Among Black Canadians. And this theme of dressing for resistance and this core ethic of style as armor is a through thread in my work. I call myself a fashion historian and curator, someone who uses fashion as a lens to ask questions of history, to look at connections between cultures, to look at exchange in terms of aesthetics and design, but also importantly to my work, a question of agency. And we cannot think of agency without thinking of huge topics like colonialism, appropriation, but also joy and ways in which this very interchange allows aesthetics to move forward and also has huge impact to many lives. Clothing is something that is so much a part of our lives in the way that we put ourselves together, whether it's a conscious choice that we make, and we are very specific about what items we put on our body and where that's sourced and how that's come into the world, or whether it be something that's in the back burner. But irrespective of that, we all have a relationship to clothing that informs the way we think and informs the way that we move through the world. And a lot of my work is unpacking those decisions, those choices, those feelings, and looking at the historical precedent, but also the ways that this historical precedent informs the present. My very first show at York University was put up on the cusp of the pandemic, and sadly had to close, just as COVID made itself a part of our lives. But it's called Reframing Gender. And the show looked primarily at the ways that people of color who are on the LGBTQ spectrum, specifically trans, queer, and non-binary, use clothing as a way of self-expression, of identity exploration, of armor, of joy, and ways in which they use clothing to go through the world. And what I did was I juxtaposed interviews with 6 members of York University's wider community, whether it be academic or folks who are PhD researchers and also teach, and also in the wider York alumni community. And I interviewed them, and I wanted to know, what was their relationship to clothing? What were their earliest memories? How was clothing a part of them understanding, coming into the fullness of who they are and continuing on that journey? And I juxtaposed those filmed interviews with examples of clothing from York University's archival collection, which comes from the theater department. And I juxtaposed these interviews to look at the ways that the archetypes that the York University collection represented. And here on the left, you can see, for example, there's that beautiful terracotta dress that's from the late 30s, I believe, all the way to the far right, which has like this kind of hot pink, very classic 1950s dress. And the way that these archetypes, whether it be something that's hyper feminine, something that's more bohemian, the ways that these ways of dressing and the way that it conditions the way that we not just think of garments, but the way that we think of gender and the way that we think of whose bodies then are allowed to inhabit these clothing and the way that that social conditioning has actually been helped, permeated, and also kind of reflexively created by clothing. And then having the intersectionality of transphobia, racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, and all these isms that the respondents were speaking to in their interviews, and having those, in a sense, speak to each other and go back and forth. I identify as Black and mixed race, and for me, and also queer. So for me, it's very important that the work that I do also centers an inclusive look at fashion history. Here you're seeing what are traditional quote unquote costumes, and I use quote unquote when I get, because it references the work I'm doing in my PhD. But here you see traditional garb specific to from a Chinese Qipao Cheongsam on the left, to a lenga and a blouse and a sherwani, which is my own. And you're seeing, I'm juxtaposing these kind of high occasion traditional garments with a quote from Gitanjali Lina in the back. And Gitanjali is a non-binary, amazing, fantastic Sri Lankan Canadian artist, researcher. And what Gita says is that in the quote they're picking out in the back is this whole sense of when you're a racialized person, you're expected to show up at events, even within the community, dressed in a certain garb. And if you don't, there's this pushback as to what that decision means. And I'm laying the groundwork for the fellowship discussion shortly, because I'm trying to show in a way how there is a foundational sense of dressing from the past and its relationship to armour and respectability and even intersectionality that we are still dealing with. My recent show at the Agnes Edison Art Center, which was very generously funded by an Ontario Arts Council grant, as well as Bader Philanthropies as part of the Isabel Bader Fellowship that I was very fortunate to be a part of, is called History's Really Black or White. If you can make it to Kingston, Ontario before March, the end of March, please see it. If not, we've got a digital exhibition that's up, and I believe a link to that, I'll see if I can put in the chat. But this exhibition looked at cotton garments in the Agnes's collection from 1790 up until 1902. And what we did is we looked at the ways that cotton in the 1800s you cannot look at cotton in the 1800s without looking at slavery, whether it be from a perspective of labor, in terms of who was picking the cotton, or whether it be from a perspective of wealth creation, the ancillary industries that were built up, whether it be the mills or folks who were supplying the boats and the shipping routes, and all the wealth that was created and then concentrated in Europe, specifically England and places like Bath and Bristol and Manchester and other places. That was a huge backbone to a lot of wealth that we still take for granted now, like all these gorgeous country homes and so on. So what we did here, specifically with the collection, the Agnes collection, was use three pillars. Science, we worked with the Queen's Isotope Lab for the Facility for Isotope Research to, in a sense, look to see if we can get into the fiber level and determine where the clothing was coming from. So I will try to summarize quickly, but basically, because I'm not a scientist of the very means, I worked with a fantastic conservator. Her name is Anne-Marie Guérin, and she worked with the Isotope Lab. And what they did is they extracted threads from each of these garments, put it through the isotope process, and basically took the fiber down to its main components of hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, strontium, lead, and I think those are it. And based on the makeup or the combination of these source elements, they can then pair that with, or at least cross-check that back with the library of data and look to see where in the world, geographically, based on a latitude, the actual cotton would have come from. So what we're trying to do is show that cotton is coming from a myriad of places in the 1800s, but it's also coming from places where we know from historical research, slavery and the labor of enslaved peoples is the main reason for the cotton production. Testing has since wrapped up, and we are literally on the edge of our seats waiting for the data to be interpreted. But we're seeing on the back there is the Agnes's collection of European and Canadian paintings, and there is a sense of the cotton supply chain that brought these garments into being. A huge part of my work is not just looking at garments, but also using art and contemporary art and performance and installation to enliven these stories and bring it into the present. We're looking at an installation by Vancouver-based artist Karen Jones, who created a screen of cotton and real black hair that interacted with this gorgeous cotton dress wedding dress from 1893. And Karen's vision for Freed, which is the name of this installation, is that for us to be able to see the dress and appreciate its gorgeous materiality and its construction, its embroidery, and the way that it fits around the bust and the way that the armholes and the sleeves are attached, and it's a gorgeous piece. But we must also see the labor. We must also see the pain. We must also recognize what happened to the earth in terms of raising these plantations, changing it over from, into monoculture to just plant cotton, and the effect that has. But also, we cannot talk about land without speaking about indigenous genocide and the peoples and the nations that have been caring for land from time immemorial. So this piece to me is, in a sense, such a core pillar of the exhibition as well, because it ties this way of fully looking at history to understand why there are so many things that we're still grappling with in 2022. The next gallery looked at a contemporary way, from a contemporary clothing lens, installation as well, of looking at one of the people groups who would have worked on picking cotton in the American South. Damon Joel is a fantastic artist who works across film and also contemporary clothing. And Damien created this fashion story called Songs of the Gullah, based on the life of the Gullah Geechee Nation, and worked in collaboration with them. And you're seeing a film as well as 3 garments that speak to the Gullah Geechee Nation's past, present, and history. And then the final room, in a sense, traces. So the first area, looking at this wider cotton supply chain, what were the big concepts that allowed this all to come together? What's the science behind allowing us to be able to make some of the claims we're making? Second room really gets you into the humanity of it. And then the third room makes it real to Canada. This room looked at the connections between the Underground Railroad and folks who would have come through the network of the network of the Underground Railroad, and were enslaved themselves or escaping. They were freed folks into Canada via the Underground Railroad, via connection, a combination of tintypes of folks who have settled in Lower Canada, also in Southern Ontario, original copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the original first printing. And what I did was, because in the tintypes, which you will see when I introduce the fellowship research, you're seeing people in gorgeous, beautiful clothing, but we don't have the clothing. No, we no longer have the clothing in archives. So what I did was what I'm calling, in a sense, archival imaginary. This way of no longer allowing the holes in archives to be able to be final. It's this way of looking across archives, looking across different ways of researching. It's a methodology that I've found to be quite empowering to my own work, to be able to allow me to ask questions, find answers, to be able to collaborate. So what I did was I looked at clothing that's similar to some of those photographs from the Agnes's collection that have no provenance. So we don't know who gave the clothing that's in the pictures, that's on the platform here, but I would like to imagine that it could be the clothing that you're seeing because of its similarities, but also to be able to ask a larger question of, well, whose clothing gets kept, whose stories get told, and how are this connected to our life now? In relation to that, these portraits are from Gordon Shadrach of contemporary Black creatives, painted in, some of which are in historic style, some of which are more contemporary clothing. And what Gordon's work brilliantly does is speak to the dearth of Black images in Western art history. What I love from this shot, the photographer wittily took, is you're seeing Gordon's portraits, and the last gallery of history is really black or white, and you're seeing a peek into the European collection, and it's just to me the juxtaposition even of this frame, of this perspective of Gordon's works, it's speaking to the lack of what you're going to see in the next room, which is the core of the European collection. So I hope from these two projects, you're getting a sense of how I pull things together, how I look at garments, how I looked at archive, look across archives. And very briefly, my current PhD work is doing a mix of that. High fashion, specifically the haute couture, the highest of the high, the thing that we normally see on red carpets, on runways, when they love to tell you, oh, this garment, cost $200,000 and 50 women took 2,000 hours to embroider all these feathers. Whenever you hear lingo like that, that normally refers to the haute couture, which is the highest form of fashion, this form of creativity. But again, based on the questions that I've been asking thus far, I ask myself, well, who is allowed to use this term couturier, and whose work is seen as valued and as valuable to be able to have this title? And haute couture is a very legally protected French term. So it's like champagne. You have to belong to a specific organization to be able to hold that term. And you can only be a fully fledged couturier if you're French. But I know from fashion history and looking at key garments along the timeline that this notion of European superiority in fashion comes from this interplay between other cultures. And I'm using India as an example here. So first dress, Lady Curzon's Peacock dress, that is one of the foundational garments in fashion, because of Worth being the father of haute couture, founded it in the mid-1800s. But what the garment is really known for is the embroidery you're seeing here, which was embroidered by the House of Kishan Chan in Delhi. And it wasn't until last year, Kathy Hay, a historian and maker and YouTuber, unearthed, or at least brought to public light, the name of the embroiderers. And up until then, for over, because Lady Curzon worked at the Delhi Durbar in 1902. So we're looking from 1902 to 2021, the name of the people the people of color who really made this garment what it is, were widely unknown. Connecting that too with, this is Balenciaga sari dress. Balenciaga, a Spanish couturier, whose French house is seen as, again, one of the masterworks, or the highest of the couture. And he's always seen as somebody who's this visionary, this master cutter, someone who, could take shears to a garment and create something new that almost looked like godlike abilities. And yet he was very influenced by other cultures. Again, using Indian as an example, this dress here is based on the sari wrapping, and the way that it's called the palu drape, and the way that the drape goes across the shoulder. But yet he's brilliantly married it here, because what you're looking at here is it's been opened up in the front to show the corsetry. So this mixture of East and West, but yet it's his genius or his way of putting together that's always credited. So the last one here is an Indian designer, Sabyasachi Mukherjee, who's one of India's foremost couturiers. And this garment is beaded and dyed and embroidered to death. And it's a gorgeous piece. And what's important here is both Sabyasachi's garment and the Balenciaga garment are in the V&A's collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum. However, the Sabyasachi piece is in the Indian collection as an ethnic costume, whereas the Balenciaga garment is stored as an example of a masterwork of fashion in the couture collection. So here, the institutions, academia, media, everything, a lot of that has a lot to play into how we look at what's considered costume, what's considered couture, and whose agency is important, because we can't talk about garment workers' rights, and we can't talk about, horrible things like Rana Plaza when, a factory collapsed and killed many people who were working in substandard conditions. We can't talk about why, how that has happened when, there are people embroidering in France and their efforts are seen as something that should be preserved and it is sacred. Why is one life and one effort sacred and the other not? There's historical precedent for this, and that's what my PhD looks like. So I hope I've kind of set up as I jump into what I'm working on here with Charmaine and the other fellows in the first cohort at NASCAD. I hope I've set up for you in a bit how my work comes together and what questions I ask and what questions I ask of archives and what questions I ask of history. So I'm just gonna take a sip of water. Dressing for the resistance, style as armor, looks at something that is highly personal to me and is highly personal to a lot of racialized folk. This sense of daily life and the way that you use clothing, and I will use similar phrases quite often, to go through the world, and why you choose to wear what you wear in specific situations is something that many of us think about, sometimes we don't, but there are times when you're pointed about it because of the many intersectional isms that you might face. If you're going to a job interview, if you're going to the bank, or if you're, like me, a foreigner, an international student in a new country, you want to be able to put forward an image that does not seem threatening, that where you will feel safe, where you will feel that your story is respected. And this sense of respectability politics is so coded and so layered in our thinking that I wanted to spend some time with the Institute unpacking where does that come from? What are the historical precedents that, find their fullness in a split-second decision I make when I wake up in the morning and I have to stand in front of a class, or I have to, go see someone and I'm grabbing one garment about another. What we're seeing here is, so what I'm going to do is introduce 6 pillars that are part of this project. And again, I'm thinking curatorially. Many fellows and many forms of research look, they are books, they're chapters, they are, sometimes books are building out databases. My work primarily asks questions of archives so that I can look at things from a curatorial perspective, because I'm always thinking of how to present this information for public consumption in 3 dimensions, physically or digitally. So as you're looking at this, think of, the show that's happening in my head and how I'm putting this all together. So there are going to be 6 pillars, the first of which I'm taking it all the way back to, the late 18th century, and looking at forms of slavery that have informed Canadian diversity. So on the left here, this very well-known portrait, of course, from 1786, portrait of a Haitian Canadian woman by Frances Malpart de Boucourt. You're looking at, of course, the Haitian Revolution. You're asking questions as to how this woman made her way from Haiti into Quebec. Of course, there are many questions to ask about her own life, how she's posed in this very contrived way. Her breast is out, is exposed, the head wrap, how that ties back into a traditional Haitian dress, but also where that comes from, going back to the continent of Africa. You're also looking at the right at, and again, this is one of the key elements of Charmaine's research, fugitive slave ads and their connection to dress, and how from that we can ask and also uncover where some of these folks would have been coming from based on the descriptions and based on also their station in life. Cash, and I believe this is Cash and Nemo, and this ad describes what they would be wearing at their time of fleeing, and the ways that clothing is being used as this form of capture, as this form of identification. And if we think of Trayvon Martin, that and the hoodie, to me, it's interesting how we haven't really moved on from life. But so this is in a sense like part of the historical pillars we're looking at. And with these two specific things, I'm looking at archives that where I could find examples of head wraps, whether it be from the 1800s or the late 1700s in the case of the portrait. I'm looking at the cord and other archives of clothing to see if we can find examples of the dress of the enslaved, which is very hard to find. And again, the second pillar historically. So again, we looked at the first pillar had to do with, slavery in the Caribbean and how that informed what was happening in Canada, but also what's happening in Canada with Canadian slavery. And also now we're looking at what's happening down south. And these are actually some tintypes from the show at the Agnes. And what you're looking at here is these are individuals, sadly, whose names we don't know, except for the person on the far right, who settled in Canada and used the medium of photography as this way of reclaiming their sense of self. I love the assuredness on their faces, especially this beautiful woman in the middle, in the way that she sits, looks directly at the camera, the way she holds her hands. And one of the questions that's asked normally of portraits like this is, well, where did this clothing come from? Like, how would they have had access to this clothing as people who either would have been enslaved or had some connection to slavery? How would this have come to be? These are also other fantastic types. This is from the Buxton collection under Shannon Prince, another fantastic archive to mine. And to answer the question with clothing, from one perspective, from a form and analysis, looking at the way that the clothing fits their bodies, it had to be tailor-made to them. Remember, the notion of clothing off the rack is a very modern one, where our sizes are standardized, and we can walk into Banana Republic and H&M, Zara, or wherever it is, and pick a 12 or 14 or 3 or 4 off the rack. Not 3 because it doesn't exist, but just have it fit our bodies. That is a completely modern notion, and especially when it comes to things like tailoring and corsetry, you cannot standardize those things, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s. So what you're looking at here is 2 examples of formerly enslaved people who actually made their own dress or were renowned for dressmaking skills. And a lot of formerly enslaved folks made their own clothing as this way of either, like, for example, seeing Elizabeth Keckley here, who was famously known as Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, the wife of Abraham Lincoln. And she used her own dressmaking skills to not just to have a local business, but also to buy her own freedom. You're also seeing here I'm just gonna look at my notes to make sure I get this correctly. This is a Calico Dress, and I believe it's from 1786. And this was made by an enslaved person whose name is Colomo. And what's interesting, was made for, I don't know the relationship between the person who owned the dress and Colomo, whether the person who wore the dress was Colomo's master or the head or owned this enslaved person, or whether it was sold to them. But what's interesting is that there's the image here, you're seeing that inscription is actually written on the hem of the garment. And you can see the date, you can see their name, and you can see the person who owned it. So, and this is coming from an archive in North Carolina. So the first 2 are the historical ones, and also there are a few other things I'm looking at as well, but those are the 2 that I'm really kind of mining at the moment. Now we're also looking into the mid-century period to look at the ways that migration coming from the Caribbean into Canada, because we're looking at this full idea of what Blackness in Canada is. It's as much coming from the continent of Africa as from the Caribbean, as from the American South, as the people like Cash and Nemo, who through their enslaved histories have been so much of a part of Canada from the beginning. Of course, we think of Afro-Indigenous folks and their intermingling and intermarriage and their culture, specifically, of course, to being in Mi'kma'ki. The ROMS, Royal Ontario Museum's Family Camera Network, has fantastic collection of family photographs. And what I looked at here is a series of photographs. I just picked out one of Ken Montague's family as they had just come from Jamaica in February 1962. And what I'm interested here is to look at the ways that their dressing probably would have adapted as they, made a new life in Toronto, and what questions they asked of themselves as they made their way around the city and had to, transition from a hot place to a colder place, but also culturally, that was very different. Ken Montague is a very respected art collector who has created the Wedge Collection, which is a fantastic holding of Black art and photography. He's also a well-known dentist in Toronto. And I'm interested to talk to Ken and to continue conversations, because we've actually started chatting about what it was like for his family when they came. What questions, what memories does he have? And what questions did he remember, for example, his mom or his aunt or his uncle or his dad thinking about in terms of clothing? What were their rites of passage around clothing? And how did respectability and ways of assimilating come into those? Looking now into the 80s, because what I'm trying to do again is bring us up to the present by looking at these pillars. And if you can think of the pillars, it's the past, the present, and it's not so much what I'm trying to do is grounded in story and grounded in history. And each story does not represent the breadth of everything, but just gives you a taste and allows you to also see an example of how, in a sense, things that started, or at least where I started the research in the 1700s, in a sense, how it progresses and develops over time. This is Iris Simpson, who is a key part of Canada's fashion history, and yet is somebody who is completely, well, for the most part, unknown. Iris was the first Black buyer with Creed's, this luxury department store that folded before, I believe they folded in the late 90s. I will double check that. But Iris also worked for Holt Renfrew as well. And she was a luxury buyer, and she bought, she would go to Paris and Milan quite frequently, and she would buy for Yves Saint Laurent, for Givenchy, very big European brands. And Iris has a fantastic collection of clothing that she brought back with that she's kept over the years. I love this picture of her. I believe this is in the 80s outside a show in Paris, and there she is with her swagger coat and scarf and being very Iris. And then this is Iris at the bottom giving a talk at the Fashion History Museum in Cambridge, Ontario. Yes, there is one. Please check it out. And Iris here is surrounded by some examples, some Saint Laurent and Givenchy examples from her own archive, and is speaking about her own life. Why I'm bringing Iris into this and why I think I'm so fascinated by her story is Iris tells, and this is a part of her own public story, of how hard it was for her as the first Black person in a lot of these rooms and having these conversations, and how, in a sense, she had to use dress as this way of armor, and this way of, in a sense, showing people that she was meant to be there and that she was competent and that she was professional and that she could do her job. She tells a story of being in New York and going to Valentino Go-See, or it's like a showroom visit. And she, wore her gorgeous red Valentino shift dress, and she had the address on Park Avenue, and she got there a little bit early, and she went up and she rang the buzzer. A doorman came. He took one look at her and he would not let her in. And Iris had the card with her invite, and she tried to explain that I'm here with Eddie Creed and the Creeds, and I'm here to buy the collection, and they would not let her in. Eventually, she had to find a payphone and call Eddie Creed, and he then had to vouch for her and they let her in. But it's very interesting that all the other white buyers were let in and Iris was not, even though she dressed the part, she looked the part, but it was her skin color that was the barrier there. So I'm interested in Iris' story because this whole notion of respectability politics, respectability will not save you. It's a famous quote. And it's looking at the ways that how this has evolved over time. I'll jump finally to the last one, just in the interest of time, so you don't run out of time. But I'm kind of now circling back to the York Project and looking at these two interviews of Sulu Klema and Sin Adaredi. Sulu is a trans man and Sin is non-binary. And the ways, and I'm going back to the footage that I have of them and the way that they talked about, in a sense, what's the culmination of everything that's I've been looking at in these historical and modern pillars of how, Sulu talks about when he was working a construction job or something, not construction, sorry, but manual labor, and how when he was in his hard hat, his boots, and how he was perceived, and how in his transition, when he socially started presenting as male, how this sense of now being seen by the world as a Black man actually became a threat to his safety, and how he adopted this sense of wearing suits and blazers, allowed people to see him differently, but also made him feel a lot more secure in the way that he walked through the world. Sin Adaredi, a fantastic person. They talk about the ways that they embrace color and body mortifications, of this way of completely rejecting respectability politics, of completely rejecting it and just finding their own way in the world and the way they go through. So what I'm really hoping to do is, as the months unfold, and this is a long-range project, and I'm going to be looking, in a sense, using these 6 stories and augmenting them, adding to them, looking for examples of clothing, photography, interviews. In the case of the more historical stuff, what databases can we look at objects? And in the case of the more contemporary folks, especially those who are very much living and vibrant, their own personal archives. And then using this as a way of creating an exhibition that will be the first at the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery that speaks to this sense of dressing for the resistance that we're very much a part of still now. And I think the social justice uprisings last of 2020, the resurgence of it anyways, really showed us that this is something that we're still very much a part of. It's still very much part of contemporary conversation. What I love, and I want to say that I'm so fortunate to be a part of this fellowship cohort, is that not just has Charmaine given, I think, a platform for this research to happen, and Emily so fantastically helped with all the admin help, but my fellows in the first cohort, Bruno Veras and Sam Guan Paris, the way that I think we share information, the way that we share research, the way that we encourage each other, to me, this is what you want from an institution where you can so often feel siloed, where there can be a sense of rivalry, or you can feel very much on your own, that you're your own little place, researching off in your own little box. But what I love is that there is a very strong family sense of the way that we support each other, we share history. And I really hope that this exhibition not just reflects my own research, but really reflects what it is the Institute's mandate is to, which is to put these topics on the map and to be able to have us have conversations, very real conversations, and hopefully meaningful change about social justice. So I'm a minute over, but I will stop there. I'll leave time for questions in chat. And thank you for listening. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Jason, for that brilliant talk and window and insight into the history of your work and also the present of what you're doing now at the Institute. And I bet a bit of the PhD was in there somehow. So It's always in there, right? Okay, so I'm going to, while people get their questions organized, please type them into the Q&A, and I'll read them to Jason if you have anything to ask, but I'll kick it off here. Okay, so much in there, Jason. Okay.
I know.
Okay, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. So one of the things that resonated with me, and probably with a lot of people, is you're discussing how does clothing inform how we move through the world? And I'm thinking, okay, how does clothing facilitate or not how we move through the world as Black folks too, historically and today? And I'm thinking about something we talked about recently, which was an enslaved man named Andrew, who shows up in a fugitive slave ad in Quebec in the 18th century. And the line is just stuck in my head. So Andrew's described as a Negro mulatto. So clearly he was born in the Americas from Maryland. His name is being born in Maryland. But James Crofton, the vintner who's hunting him, his enslaver, says he's remarkable for being clean dressed and wearing cloth around his head. So head wrapping. Okay. But the remarkable for clean dress too resonated with me because in my other readings, I've come across, information that said that often free and enslaved Blacks were seen as highly suspicious in different places in the Americas by whites for looking too good, right? So there's a case that Shane White talks about in his writing about New York State, where he says 2 Black men were taken up by the local, police and thrown in jail. And then that police officer printed an ad saying, these 2 are basically suspicious. They look too good. I threw them in jail. Whoever owns them, come forward and get them. So it was because they were dressed so well, right? And then I'm thinking about today with, as Black folks, we have our terminology. We get racially profiled for driving while Black, for shopping while Black, for eating while Black, by daring to go to Starbucks while Black. Anyway, there were recent cases at Barney's in the USA where, Black people after the purchase were stopped upon exiting the stores when they're purchasing what? High-end garments and objects, right? And Oprah even couldn't purchase, couldn't see. Yes, right?
the famous Hermes story. Yes.
Yeah. So that's a lot to throw at you, but just can you talk more about this? How we move.
It's funny that you should mention about Andrew, because to me, that's one of the key examples that we can look at how this sense of how the Black body is supposed to look, and this sense of poverty of dress, and how poverty of dress is then aligned to race and aligned to a physical type. And the reason why, the Oprah scenario is completely tied back to that Andrew scenario, right?
Yeah, right.
If you want to control a population, the first thing you do is control their clothing. Or the first thing you do is control their sense of identity, rather. And form of identity is clothing. You don't have to talk, like when folks were disembarking off the ships, the first thing they did was, they become a part of everything that they had that had some type of personal marker of identity that reminded people that they were their own.
Right.
And when you want to subdue, you want to subjugate, you want to control, you want to take away somebody's agency where they believe that their surroundings are not who they are. And I could totally see how then they would have wanted to continually control folks like Andrew, because then how then would they be able to assert status, and how then will be able to assert who then is allowed to be free and who then is allowed to control and be controlled.
Right. And that's so complex too, because of course, for us today, we look back at history and try to figure out, well, what did a free Black look like in the period of slavery? Because that population is still under the burden of colonialism and racism and impoverished because they're Black people in the period of slavery, whether or not they're free. So what does a free Black look like? And do we actually have a case there where Andrew was trying to look like a free person because he knew he was going to try to escape and pass himself off as such? But I have a question from the audience from Colleen McIsaac. Thank you, Colleen. So Colleen says, I was really struck by your mention of Trayvon Martin and the hoodie. I am wondering if you could speak to this a bit more in terms of the hoodie as a piece of clothing that has become synonymous with being a target of white violence. Thank you, Colleen.
Oh, I mean, going back to this whole sense of who's allowed to wear what, and Blackness and luxury and the hoodie. Like, it's funny how, well, by funny, I mean not funny, but right now the fall, winter 2022 shows are happening for men's in Milan, in Florence, in PT Uomo. And if you look at the collections online, Vogue or GQ, whatever, it's been, all these brands are turning out these high fashion, really beautifully, designed versions of the hoodie, whether it be, Balenciaga and all these big brands. Of course, you got to think of Virgil Abloh, Dearly Departed, Off-White, and Vuitton. And the hoodie is now a huge high fashion. It has been for some time, but even more so, this sense of selling the urban cool. Mm-hmm. But yet it depends on who's allowed to wear that and who has access money-wise, but also when you're looking at who's popular and for whom it's seen as threatening, where is Blackness and how does Blackness situate itself? And yet when someone like Trayvon, who, was initially seen as being threatening because of the Blackness of the hoodie, and how that's tied into this sense of urban spaces, of Blackness, of ghetto, and all these terms that have now been coded and then collated together that then, and fatally for this child, you have to ask yourself, at what point do we need to have a critical look at clothing and our perceptions? Dr. Matthews David, fantastic researcher at Ryerson University. Her work looks at the fashion of crime. And I'm going to quote her research because she's been hugely influential to me, because she looks at the way that, in a sense, if you look at criminals over history, the ones who've really gotten away with it are those who have been fancily dressed. The frock coat, the corset, the dress, turned out of people of quote unquote high society, of people with wealth. And many times they're able to get away with it, or they're able to conceal their weapons because they were not perceived of as being dangerous. Whereas we perceive, based on the messages we've been fed and also historical precedent, back to Andrew and these ads and how we see the enslaved Black body as being something to be controlled, because that dress is tied with that body, we therefore then perceive that person as being dangerous. Whereas Allison's research really looks at the fact that, in fact, it's the other way around. We are looking so much at the ways that our perceptions affect who we code as being dangerous. And many times it's not the people who you think it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I personally, if I'm trying to, exist in certain spaces, will not wear a hoodie. And that's a decision that I've made for my own personal safety. Mm-hmm. I have to do. And it's something that, you grapple with daily. Mm-hmm. But hopefully what I think what the project is that we're trying to look at with the Institute is, what is the precedent for this? And where do these ideologies take hold? Right. We're just dealing with the same issues over and over again.
Right. Thank you for that, Jason. I was wondering too, if you could break down a bit more in detail. So you have those wonderful tintypes in early 19th century photographs of Black sitters. And I just have to say, for people who don't understand this, that breakthrough moment when photography becomes widely accessible is so key for Black communities emerging out of slavery, because, of course, as Jason articulates, that's the first moment where Black people get to self-represent outside of the hands of white society and white enslavers. So that's so important for us. And to Jason's amazing, like your eye and your knowledge is tremendous, that you can read the fact that those were clothes that were made for those individuals by how they fit them. Okay, so what I was thinking here is I just want to back up and make sure everybody understands that the history of slavery in places like Jamaica and the American South were ones where many enslavers and planters gave cloth rations to enslaved females on the plantation, cheap flax material known as Austenberg, and said, here, make clothing for everybody. So there was a forced standardization, and there was an increase of labor imposed on these women. And then people ended up looking very similar, of course, unless they took the extra labor to dye or perfume their clothing, et cetera. But then I'm thinking then, the burden of our ancestors then is the denial of access to materials, the denial of access to the leisure time to make the clothing, and then of course the cost and the added social and physical work to do those perform those extra labors. So Jason, are there core issues, or to borrow your word, pillars within and across Black dress, which that you see as then necessary for our understanding, whether we're dealing with that slave history or dealing with today? Like, are there things you just have to get if you want to talk about Black people and dress history?
Oh, sure. It's first of all the ingenuity and this sense of resisting through garments, irrespective of the surroundings. Like, to me, that come up in all of the pillars. Like, I'm thinking of, it's specific to Andrew, the example you shared. Andrew would have known that presenting the way he did, clean cut, head wrapped in a certain way, would have been perceived as dangerous or therefore then be looked at with a questioning eye. But yet he decided to do it anyway.
Anyway, yeah.
This was his way. I don't want to project, but I'm going to guess, because to make such a public statement that's so highly visible had to come from a highly personal choice.
Yeah.
To, irrespective of what the pushback, or in his case, it could actually be corporal punishment.
Yeah.
Irrespective of what would come back, he decided to make that.
Yeah. And Andrew is so amazing, because it's not that he's super clean dressed to the point that the enslaver perceives this. He's also not unafraid to demonstrate publicly his retention of African dress culture. He's wrapping his head. So that's going to make him stand out even more in a place like Quebec, right? Yeah. Okay.
And in the case of folks who like Elizabeth Keckley and the person who made that garment that I showed earlier, irrespective of all the pressures that are put on them, like you said, the clothing rations, responsibilities to community, no time to I'd really love to read more and understand, how were these folks just self-taught? Where at some point did somebody sit with them and teach them, how to make some of the clothing? Because at some point there had to be a starting point for, because I know they're obviously bringing with them clothing traditions from the African nations that they came from, but that had to be adapted to Western dress. At some point in time, irrespective of everything, they picked it up and then they passed it on and then they adapted it and they kept that going. In the case of Elizabeth Keckley, she kept that going to the point where she was able to free herself of that situation. And in the case of the folks who, in the tintypes you're seeing, then able to reclaim it to the point where, they're now making their own clothing. It's no longer a case of mending the clothing of the folks who own their owners, or creating clothing for them or such like that. So at all, and even with Sulu, going to 2020, he is, he knows that he's going to face, he's going to be seen because being now socially presenting as a Black man, he's going to. This notion of Black safety, going back to Trayvon Martin, and with masculinity and being read as being malicious and dangerous, but yet he's going to wear his clothing anyways. Sin is going to push against respectable politics, and they're going to wear their bright colors. It's almost like Andrew. Sin is wearing everything they want to wear, all their piercings, all their tattoos, because it's their way of owning their own self, irrespective of what the social structures say. And you see that throughout these pillars and throughout all our stories. We will always find our ways to remind ourselves of where we're from and who we are.
Right. And I loved your juxtaposition of Cash, who's escaping from Hugh Ritchie, who was, by the way, everybody, a tailor. And she's escaping this huge bundle of clothing, petticoats and stays and bonnets. And your juxtaposition, with Mary Todd Lincoln's formerly enslaved dressmaker, the name again?
Elizabeth Keckley.
Wow. So were you saying that Elizabeth was able to purchase her freedom through the sale
through her dressmaking skills. Wow. And then she and then she was able to then create a business out of that. Anne Lowe was another person who, although Anne was not enslaved herself, I believe it was in her lineage, but the dressmaking skills were passed down. And Anne made Jackie Kennedy's dress, and it actually was not credited as designer until much, much, much later on.
Wow.
But these are people who are making garments for high society privilege, and their own histories are very much not.
Right. And we've discussed how profoundly deep that history of Black enslaved people being forced to make the clothing of the white enslaver, clean it, mend it, right? All of it, right? At the same time that you might be wearing Osnaburg or something, right? That's completely the opposite of what you're forced to make. So those horrendous, violent disparities.
I think of like the laundry process, and I mean, they didn't have the pods that you put into the washing machine. And no, Dick, think of how laborious it had to be to keep cotton pristine, and to be able. I mean, this is just the life on the plantation, and just the amount of work that the labor went into being a dress. To me, it astounds me how I think folks have been able to rise above using dress as this way of as a medium of doing that.
Okay, so I have one last question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask for your last words for us. So Professor Lisa Merrill, who teaches at Hofstra, is asking, contemporary examples like the hoodie. I wonder if you have considered reactions to Black persons wearing masks and the racist responses to white spectators. Also, do you know Dwight McBride's Why I Hate Abercrombie and Fitch? So what type of mask, Lisa, can you type in what type of masks you're thinking of there?
Dwight McBride's Why I Hate Abercrombie. I mean, I also...
Yeah.
But interesting. I can imagine what the article's about, but I must read it. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, I'll try to remember that.
Yeah.
Sorry, the first part of the question had...
Yeah, consider reactions to Black persons wearing masks, but I'm not quite sure, Lisa, what type of mask you're thinking about there. So maybe you could type that in for us if you have a second. The other thing I just want to point out as we wrap up, I know we're over time, but I mean, this is Jason Cyrus, so I'm sorry. An hour doesn't, no, an hour does not cut it, my friend. Okay, we could keep you here all day and all night, but I want to point out to people here that Jason's extraordinary, and you're extraordinary innovative, and you're one of a kind at this moment in Canada, I'm sure, because here Jason is coming from art history, also from material cultural studies, from Canadian slavery and transatlantic slavery studies and Black Canadian studies. And you then have had to create, we were just talking about this today in my class. When does the scholar, curator, artist have to create the space for themselves in these fields and disciplines, which otherwise would not accommodate you? So can you just say a word about your path to where you are now? Because you are it, my friend. There are people looking to you. You need to start mentoring people. I'm sure you already are.
The last thing you need to do is look to me. I start from a selfish perspective. I work on the projects I want to see in the world. Again, this comes back to ingenuity and resistance, right? I am so sick and tired of, I love fashion history, and I love fashion. It's one of my greatest passions. But I'm so tired of not seeing whole histories, of not seeing inclusive histories. I went to an exhibition at the Met on camp a few years ago, and I came out enraged. I remember thinking, how could you talk about camp without talking about the ballroom scene? How could you talk about camp without talking about queerness? And specific to Latinx and Black trans folk, why is an institution as hallowed as the Met only trace its white lineage and not look at it in a more inclusive way? So it's, I work on the projects that I want to see happen, the stories that I want to see, and I try to find like-minded folks, places where I could feel supported, where I could contribute something, and I hope that people can contribute to me, like the Institute and with you and Bruno and Samguan. And I just try to find ways to collaborate, because this notion of the singular genius is complete and total nonsense. It's a colonial construct that there's the one person who has all the ideas and will then disseminate knowledge down.
And give birth to the next person and the next person and the next, right? That canonical nonsense. Yeah.
We work alongside, we work in collaboration, and we encourage, and then we tell stories. That's how I think research works.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. It's extremely hard. I mean, I'm also conscious, I don't want to go over time, but I'm also conscious that I'm someone who looks as a Black man in the world, studying Black topics, curating Black shows. It becomes this thing of where people are like, oh, so is that all you have to say? Is that all you have to look at? Yet nobody asks the white curator why their entire career is about Picasso.
Yeah.
It's just
never.
Nobody says, oh, Victorian lace. Don't you have anything else to say? But no, all these topics are valid.
Yeah.
And I've just come to the point where I'm selfish. I want to see my own, and I want to work on. I want to have the work that's created out of collaboration mean something in the world.
Thank you, Jason. So just to tie up Lisa's question, she's saying she's thinking about current COVID masks and the ways that racist whites have been reacting to Black men in masks and the danger that represents to persons of color.
That's a good one. That's a deep one.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, because white people can wear masks anywhere, but when the Black man puts a mask on, they're coming to rob you, right?
Right. Oh, this is true.
Is it? Yeah.
This is true.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
That's a good one. That's a heavy one.
That's a heavy one. Yeah, we need more time for that one, right? Do you need more time for that one?
Yes,
But thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. That's definitely something to stew on. I just wanted to say there before we close on too that to your point, I love it when you said you were pissed off, you were frustrated in that lecture, right? But let's not forget, for a lot of us, being upset and frustrated and, that's generative for us. It's like, then go do something different. Then go show what should have been said and done. Then go write something. Then go blog, right? So I just want, especially to the students, to understand that don't stay in that moment of pissedness, if that's a word. Go and do something about it, right?
Yeah, I can't complain that shows are not representing our experience if I don't add something to that conversation. Right. And I don't try to see how things can be done in a different way. That's a huge part of the work that I want to do.
Right.
We all have to see our stories represented, all of us.
Yeah.
We're all connected in this world.
Yeah.
I have no time anymore for someone asked me recently on a podcast why my work matters. And I immediately asked the counter question, why does work that is not centered in inclusivity and decoloniality matter? Why is that work still happening?
Yeah.
And why are we not all on board with telling all our stories? Don't second guess my work anymore. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of that. I have myself and others and people coming up after me to think about.
You are brilliant, Jason. Thank you so much. I'm so fortunate to have you as a part of that first cohort. I just want to say again that the Black History Month panel for the Institute is taking place at 12 p.m. noon Atlantic Standard Time on Tuesday, February 15th. And that will include the wonderful Jason Cyrus, who you've met here. Who does not want to hear him speak again? I want to hear him speak again, of course. Bruno Veras, the other two members of the cohort, Bruno Veras and Sam Guan-Paris as well, will be on that panel. So please come back and share that information. Emily, who works with me at the Institute, has put in the chat, I believe, the links for that. So that is great. And Jason, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. Can you just tell them about the show, The Agnes, and that they can access it online and when it comes down?
Yes.
In case anyone's burning to get to Kingston, right? Maybe they can see it face to face.
And everything is closed anyways because of COVID. So History is Really Black or White is on until March 20th. But if you go on the Agnes's website, I believe our show loads first. If you click on that and you scroll down, you'll be able to click on that again, you'll enter into a website that gives you, basically it's an online exhibition. It detail with the isotope research stuff that I wasn't able to unpack clearly. It looks at videos of installations and all the topics and research and so on. So please definitely check that out. And otherwise, keep doing what you're doing. Keep the questions you're asking of your research, the questions you're asking of archives, of yourselves, of other stories. Keep doing that. The things you're passionate about are what is needed in the world. That's my takeaway.
Thank you. And you're getting a bunch of thank you so much. This is fantastic. Great talk. So thank you, audience, too, for coming, and thank you for staying. And thank you again, Jason Cyrus, for a tremendous talk. We'll see you very, very soon. Take care, everybody, and thank you for being here.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.